Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. It looks like the most important or the issue that got the most attention on the weekend was the visit by the president. He went down there on a social call, maybe a summer vacation, who knows what, but he ended up in Cuba. But it did get a lot of attention. I think it's fascinating. I've sort of always leaned in the direction of doing more with Cuba, so I found it pretty interesting. It's probably no guarantee that we're going to have perfect relations, and I'm sure there's still some people out there that aren't too happy with this. But I'm sure you saw that on the news, and I'm just wondering what you were thinking about on this.
Yeah, it was an amazing scene to see the whole Obama family coming off of Air Force One touchdown in Havana. They say it's the first time in 90 years since Calvin Coolidge that a U.S. president set foot on Cuban soil. So it certainly was an historic event.
Yeah. So we have to just think, though, what it's going to lead to, and the complaints are. There are complaints from the neocons, but they've complained for several months and they've complained for years. Yeah. I recall, campaigning a few years ago in Miami on the debates. The older audience, Republican tradition people, when I mentioned that we ought to start talking about Cuba and doing more with them, there was a little bit of booing and hissing, but I was getting used to that after a while. But the next day I met with a large group of young Cuban Americans, and they were all for open up the doors, let us go there. We can't even send Kleenexes and toilet paper to our relatives down there. So there were so many restrictions. So they were all for it. So, but the sign of the times came that things were changing, and I think for the better.
I remember that debate, and it had such a funny moment where it was supposed to be the dramatic, the phone rings and you get a call and it's Castro on the line. What would you say? Your answer was funny.
Well, I don't know how great it was. I thought it was less than perfect. I'd ask him what he wants, But the audience responded on that occasion favorably. But immediately afterwards, and this happens, I imagine, to more people than just me, you think, I could have given a better answer. And my thoughts were what I should have said or followed up with. Castro, it's about time we took you guys on in a baseball game. Thinking back about how the ping pong games with China helped to break the ice. And I think sports are just great. That's why I was so disappointed with Jimmy Carter when he decided to not allow our athletes to go to Moscow because of Afghanistan. Yeah. But anyway, I think it's very positive. But this does not mean there's going to be an ambassador. That has to take Congress, and there'll be a lot of fighting and fuming. But overall, I thought the general sentiments were less hostile because it looked too positive for people to sort of pile on right now and condemn this because it's so different than us threatening people or sending drones, and it's so different than what we're doing in Iraq, getting ready to send more troops to Iraq when we said there'd be no troops on the ground. It is so different, but in a way our foreign policy, not only just this administration, but in general, it's so schizophrenic. It goes from we're the best people in the world and we love everybody and we'll take care of everybody to the part where it says if you don't do exactly as we say, we will put sanctions on you and we'll use military force against you, even though you've been a close ally of ours forever and ever. We're going to turn on you, and that has happened so often. But on this occasion, I think it was on the positive side.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned baseball because one of the things apparently today they're going to do is sit down together and watch a game between the Tampa Bay Rays and the Cuba national team. So they will have the game that you wanted after all,
Yeah, but the big problem there is people are going to be worried they might beat us. So who knows? We'll see.
But I think it's a good point, and a lot of the detractors from the visit said that, this is terrible. Castro didn't go and meet him at the plane. He always does this. But I think, to me at least, and you pointed out, I think it's by design. Obama and his family came off the plane, and it didn't look like a state visit because it wasn't the head of state meeting the head of state. It was more. It gave it a different tone, and I think that was probably by design. It was probably wise to leave it that way.
And I think that it will be a benefit. One criticism I heard, which I find just just ridiculous. Not that it's wrong, because it was an accurate statement, but it was so hypocritical on our part. Some of our neocons said, and I think this is one of the conditions that the negotiators are going to work with, you got to assure us that human rights are protected in Cuba, which is a good idea. That'd be nice if we could do that. But when are we going to do that here at home? Yeah. When are we going to protect human rights? When are we going to admit that we have more prisoners in our prison? We don't have, equal justice and the law. If you're poor and a minority and you smoke marijuana, you're liable to be in prison for a long time. Sometimes you go to prison with a nonviolent crime for life. So this idea that there's some political prisoners there, which I don't have any doubt, but it also goes back to the hypocrisy of our relationship with Cuba over the many years, because we were on Batista's side, but Batista was no angel. He had been elected leader from 40 to 44, but in 1952, when he became dictator, it was a coup. And the coup was planned in the United States. And you wonder, well, this just fed into the pro-independent Cubans. It just happened that the pro-independent Cubans were following a Marxist viewpoint rather than one of free markets and liberty, even though Marti in the 19th century was arguing that case, for independence. But Cuba hasn't been independent for a long, long time, and then when 1998 comes along, which, how much did we precipitate there? The Cubans didn't attack America, but they got a declaration of war. But what was the motivation? Maybe the Philippines and Puerto Rico was involved. Maybe that neat little base, Guantanamo, was involved. And all of a sudden we know that they ended up, us owning that base, and we gave independence to Cuba. But we really owned Cuba, under the dictators that we controlled, and that was the motivation for the revolution to come in. And when you think of how Castro started in the early 50s, with a few dozen people that he moved in there and fought in the mountains, but that means that the sentiment of the people, he had to get some support from the people in order to accomplish that. And once again, it was the backfiring, the blowback, the unintended consequences of our foreign policy. Sure, we had a lot of successes, and we owned a lot of land, and we owned the sugar and everything else in Cuba, so there was a material benefit. But eventually, it comes back to haunt us, and I think that's what happened. It's taken a long time to correct those problems.
Yeah, and under the Batista dictatorship, a lot of the people that were forced to flee when Castro overthrew him are really the basis of the Miami right-wing Cubans. They had all the goodies under Batista, and they're just bitter that they had some of the privilege taken away. But on the issue of Obama's visit, I think in some ways there's an ambivalent feeling that we have as people who are pro-private sector, because the specter of a head of state going over there, meeting another head of state to talk about the economy and these sorts of things, is it looks nice, but there's a downside to it, because what I'm sure you would rather see would just be to simply open the doors and let every American go. And I look at the agenda. President Obama is going to speak with Raul Castro today, and he said he's going to talk to him about economic reform and human rights. And as you point out, we could use both of those here.
When you get freedom as an individual or marketplaces, you release creative energy. But when the governments get involved, they wreck things, because then somebody will come up and say, well, somebody is out competing us, so we need a little bit of help and we need protection, or we hurt our own businesses by overtaxing and over-regulating. So therefore they get in. They say, well, talk to them and sort this out. Then they have to say, well, we have to come up with not free trade, we have to have managed trade. Well, who's going to manage it? Another level of government. So it becomes the opposite, and that's why some of the complaints about our trade agreements are absolutely justified, because I was opposed to all those trade agreements where the power is delivered to the president illegally to design these programs. So under those circumstances, it's not free trade that they criticize. Managed trade is horrible, but I don't think I've heard anybody campaigning in this year where they say, well, we need to do is get out of all those agreements. But I think if for an individual, if you release if you give them their freedom or there's free markets, you release creative energies and people work in their own self-interest. And sometimes that scares the living daylights out of people. But if their own self-interest is designed to make money and be successful and hire people, then there's nothing wrong with that. This is very positive. But once the governments get in the business of management, I think that's what you're alluding to, is the fact that the corporations are lining up. Who will get to deal? But they were doing that, and they continue to do that with Iraq, and they can't get agreement. Who really controls the oil over there? And that's been a big argument. And look how we've been involved in the Middle East to control natural resources and things. So they just don't understand the basic principle of the limitation of government power, to not ever allow governments to use aggressive force to manipulate markets or people or other countries. It's not complicated, but everybody has an exception. I'm for liberty except. Yeah. I'm for freedom except for this or for this. And I'm for non-intervention overseas with our friends who listen and do what we tell them, but we're for intervention when we have to deal with our national security, which is a cop-out.
Yeah, way back in another life, I had the opportunity to spend some time in states that were just emerging from communism. And it was fascinating to watch. You talk about pent-up energy. You're so absolutely right, because from the very first days in places like Albania and Hungary, after the communists fell, you saw a really messy emergence of real capitalism. You saw people with a little stand selling something. And it wasn't pretty, but they were experiencing the market and how it works for the first time, and they were so energized. The problem happened when places like Hungary and Albania became close to the U.S. government. Now we're in the same camp, we're freedom. And then the U.S., what did they do? They sent in a bunch of professors, a bunch of experts on law. You've got to create a legal taxation system. You've got to do this and that. Then they sent in the NGOs. You've got to hire people at this rate. You've got to do this. And before long, they completely destroyed all of this wonderful energy that was being released.
And how often one of the first things we advise that they do is they get an IRS and a central bank. And then when it fails, as one would expect, and as our system is failing, the critics who want to take advantage of that and say, see, we told you that freedom doesn't work. Free markets hurt. And, and they won't identify this as corporatism and the power of corporate interest and the power of the financial interest to set up all these trade agreements as well as a Federal Reserve System to allot credit, because the prediction is under those circumstances you will always wipe out the middle class, and there will be pseudo-prosperity for a while, but it will all be based on debt. And then it ends up with a cataclysmic ending, and that is the bust. And we've experienced a boom here, and these other countries have. But what the intellectual challenge for us is to point out that they can't blame freedom for this. And I think back what happened in the Depression. The blame for the 20s was placed on the gold standard and too much capitalism, too much freedom, and yet the same circumstances were there because it was not free markets, and there was inflation and all the other mischief going on. So it's crucial. This is why a little bit of politicking in a campaign here and there might garner some interest to challenge people to go and look. But ultimately, none of this gets solved. None of these problems get solved unless people look at this in a principled sort of way, because that's what answers the question. They say, well, they're not interested in that. We need people who are more pragmatic. But everything we have today, and everything the communists have, and the fascists have, and the Keynesians have, it's all intellectually backed by it. It's been written about, it's understood, it's taught in the schools, and it's propaganda that raised generation after generation to believe this. So the challenge is great. But the opportunity is wonderful, because this system is coming apart, whether it's our foreign policy and trade policy and the way we should treat other people is failing. And hopefully this new generation that has become fascinated with free market economics in the real sense and has become fascinated with reducing the size and scope of government, I think is a wonderful thing coming. I do want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. And I think this episode of our president going down to Cuba should be looked at in a positive way, even in spite of the many negatives that people might point out. Compared to our president ordering bombs and more troops in the other parts of the world and getting involved in coups, that is detrimental. So if we could just have a more friendly relationship with more people and realize that there's other ways to deal with these problems, but we have a long way to go, but it is certainly a lot better than the day I got my draft notice in 1963. 1962, I got my draft notice that because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that I would be called to military duty, and it was over Cuba. So I think we're a long way from that, and therefore we should continue the progress made. I would say today and this weekend and what the president's doing is a step in the right direction, and hopefully we can build on it. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the Liberty Report today, and please come back soon.